Well, if you could choose a different career path, maybe something you wrote about in the engagement package, or even something that isn't sociology focused, what else would you do?
Hmm. That's a good question. I've been actually thinking about that a lot more so recently, and I think beyond education, like I said, whether that's K through 12 or the college university or however else you may look at that, I've always felt that I've been pretty interested in government politics, whatnot. So whether that could be political science or, like I said, maybe getting involved in government, well, local, state, federal, anything like that. And I think more so nowadays, I'm really beginning to see the importance, the integral structure that local government plays. So I'm actually in the process of, even in just like our local community, getting more involved with local government, with our municipal government, county government. Like I said, attending meetings, hoping to join some committees and subcommittees. So I think maybe something along those lines. And a lot of that also, once again, pertains to, sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, because once again, it basically pertains to everything and it heavily influences and is influenced by other things as well.
I was thinking about because you teach both K through 12 as well as college level. How do you think teaching language in K through 12 is? For example, in the sense of when I was in South Korea and learning Korean, I found that it was useful to me, so I needed to learn it. But in the sense of maybe kids in a English-based setting, they would be learning this language and think, why am I learning this? I don't need to use this. I only ever use it in class. How do you combat that sense of like this language is important and it is important to someone else's country, even though it's not maybe necessarily important in your mind's view? What do you think?
That's Yeah, that's a good question. I encounter that question a lot. I think especially with teaching French in the United States, because typically when you're thinking about learning another language in the United States, typically you would think Spanish, right? Because obviously there are more Spanish-speaking people and Spanish-speaking, like I said, Spanish-speaking people in the United States, and there is a significant French-speaking population in the United States too, but not nearly as large as Spanish-speaking. So I think to answer that question, I would have to say that at least with my students, I remind them, and this is actually something that I do usually, maybe not on the first day, but within the first couple of days of school, the first week, first couple of weeks, is I remind them of how global the language French really is. So I think it's an exercise in understanding that the world is not necessarily just their community or their county, their state, or even their country, right? They're part of a global society, right? Even if they don't necessarily always actively engage with it. So now, for example, and I mentioned this in one of, like I said, my opening presentations, introductions for the school year, is that it has been estimated that around the year 2050, French is going to be, I think the what was it? I think the second or third most widely spoken language in the world. So currently, I believe it is sixth or seventh, I think. I have to double check that. So it's still very widely spoken, but I think just for the aspect, or for the perspective that, like I said, oh well, I might not necessarily use French as often as I would use Spanish in the United States, right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn it, or any other language that isn't English or Spanish, right? You're always going to have opportunities to speak that language. I also encourage students that, well, you can learn French because it'll open up, your opportunities for travel. So, I mean, obviously, one of the closest places that they can go to where they speak French is Quebec. So, not that far from us. And at least for us in New Jersey, a 6 hour drive if you want to take a plane from either, Newark or New York or Philly, right? Only about, maybe an hour, hour and a half or so. So it does, like I said, there is an opportunity for students to actively and genuinely use the language. And I think also for the fact that I also try to remind students that it's not necessarily about just, using the language just to use it, but like I said, understanding a different culture. So as you mentioned before, right, I think students, especially at a younger age, are like, when am I going to use this? And I think that's a legitimate question. I'm not saying it isn't, But I try to instill in students and say, okay, well, you may not necessarily use it every single day. And I understand that you may not see a French speaking person every single day in your life. But like I said, I think to have that experience of just growing as a person, learning about a different culture, gaining a different appreciation for a culture that's outside of your own. Like I said, it's such a rewarding experience. And there are also the neurological benefits as well, where research has consistently shown that learning any new language will help with cognitive functioning and processing. Like I said, there's so many benefits just outside of, well, okay, I can speak French or I can speak this language. I can communicate with those people who also speak that language.
I would have absolutely loved to have someone when I was a student really encourage it from a broader perspective. I took French in junior high school and high school. My grandfather was Creole, and so my goal was to be able to at least have some conversation with him. And then we went to Quebec, and that really sparked it. But there wasn't the additional encouragement around me at that time. We didn't live near my grandfather, and so there really was nobody, other than school, for speaking the language. And so opening students' eyes to the bigger picture, I think would have been really helpful for me. When I got to college, I switched to Spanish. Well, that didn't help because I didn't know enough of either, in all honesty. And so if I try to speak, it comes out a combination of languages. So you're probably one of the few people who would understand me, Walter, because it'll come out English, French, and Spanish.
Well,
Um,
there you go.
so, you go with it.
And honestly, that's the reality of the situation too, is that I know that no one really brought it up as a question or anything, but I guess I'll just add it in because your
Mhm.
comment just sparked in my mind was that I noticed, and this is not necessarily just for French, but I think it's for learning any language. I think at least the way that language is more traditionally taught, say in schools in the United States, where for example, I mentioned before, even in my own experience, like I said, in a public school where Spanish in elementary school was relegated to 1 or 2 days a week, maybe for 30, 40, 45 minutes, whatever it may have been. And that's kind of it for a while until you get to at least middle school. So, with that being said, I see that there are a lot of students who may have the interest in the language or the culture, but then they get a little intimidated. I'm like, well, okay, maybe we're speaking the language or we're engaging with the language in class, but then like if I don't necessarily do my own practice, then those skills will get a little bit rusty, or maybe I won't, develop the speaking skills to the same fluency that I'm hoping for, maybe like I do in English or my native language. Like I said, I see it as an experiment in testing one's boundaries and going beyond those boundaries because at least in my estimation, I would say that I mean, not to discredit anything else in school, obviously, that any other subjects or materials that are taught, but I feel as though that learning a new language is probably one of the scariest and maybe most intimidating things that one can do at that level. Like I said, especially it's just something that is so encapsulating. It's so broad, it's so wide ranging. And I really saw that too when I've taught AP French. And I think as an instructor, like I said, and having had experience with the language and the culture and everything, I even found myself struggling teaching AP French because, I mean, for any of the AP languages, there are so many different topics and themes that are covered for the test. And I felt myself sort of, almost kind of like ripping my hair. I'm like, how am I going to get these students up to the proficiency that they need for the test? So, like I said, it's quite a journey to embark on, but I think it's such a rewarding experience because it opens up so many opportunities. It really does. Like I said, there's the neurological advantage of, like I said, you're working different parts of your brain that normally are not worked because, just for various reasons. Like I said, that they focus more on language acquisition. And if you're not learning a language, then, well, obviously they're not going to be really activated. It's a risk, but it's really worth the risk, though, I think.
So how has AI changed learning languages?
So that's actually something that I've been exploring a lot more recently, even with professional development. So I've had the opportunity in the past year and a half, 2 years or so, to really start to dive into that. And so one of the okay, so actually, well, quite a few conferences, but one of the conferences I went to was specifically targeted on AI, the use of AI to develop communicative skills and comprehension or comprehensible input with world language. So it's really dizzying to see the number of programs that are being developed and are, like I said, I feel like every time I go to a conference, it's like there's like a dozen more programs that have been developed since the last time I went to a conference. And I think it does feel overwhelming, but it also shows that there is such a great opportunity to have students language in ways that were just not really available before. So, for example, it was interesting, even just something simpler for those who listen to podcasts. So you may have your Apple Podcast app. My wife and I were just talking about this just a few days ago, where, for example, and I tell my students this too, is like, beyond the classroom, like make sure that you engage with the language in some way, shape, or form. So I tell them to use Duolingo, like I said, especially for basic acquisition. It's a great resource to use. For more advanced students, I would say, listen to a podcast, listen to a TV show, or, watch a TV show, watch a movie. Listen to music, do something like that, read a journal article, read a newspaper article. But the podcasts, like I said, I just happened to see this the other day, depending on which podcast that you listen to or from which provider that you get your podcast sources from, there will come with like an AI transcript. So we happened to just see that the other day, and we were talking like, oh my gosh, this would be great. Because there was a source that I was using. There was a resource I had been using in my class, which was News and Slow French. So it was basically the idea that it would be curated articles related to current events, world events, whatever is going on at that given time. And they would be leveled appropriately for whatever level of student you have. So beginner, intermediate, advanced, so forth and so forth. So anyway, you would have a transcription of the podcast, you would be able to read it, and you'd also be able to listen to the podcast while you are reading. And it's like I said, you're working on the listening comprehension as well as reading comprehension. So like I said, I noticed with Apple Podcasts, right, there's something similar that's been developed recently where there's a wider range of podcasts that are available. They're not necessarily level, they're not necessarily regulated in the same way as they are with this News and Slow French, or there's also News and Slow Spanish, News and Slow German, News and Slow Italian, so forth and so forth. It's a more, at least in my opinion, a more authentic, genuine experience, but you still have those structures, you still have those modifications in place that help students to be able to access those resources. So that's something, and like I said, it's not necessarily AI independently of itself, but as it is an AI product. Another thing that has been really good as well, especially I think to develop listening as well as speaking ability, are chatbots. So there are quite a few different programs that we can use for AI chatbots, and the teacher, educator, whoever is creating the chatbot can specifically program the chatbot to speak with students at a certain level, talk about certain topics and themes. And you can even, depending on which model or I guess plan that you have for that particular program, you can also program the bot to use particular vocab terms that maybe you're learning in a lesson, so that the chatbot doesn't stray off and use more advanced vocabulary or grammatical structures that the students are familiar with. Once again, I think there's the debate about whether it's authentic or genuine, but I do find it as a really valuable resource just for the fact that the students have a more genuine opportunity to speak or to listen to someone. Obviously it's an AI chatbot, but still to simulate that conversation, get real life feedback in the moment, and not have to wait, for myself or someone else to be like, oh, well, the pronunciation sounds good, but maybe you should do this and that, right? The AI chatbot will do that for them, which is really, it's a huge time saver. And like I said, it gives students a little bit more autonomy to do their own learning at their own pace and on their own timeline or their own wavelength, basically. So I think there's so many great opportunities. Like I said, I honestly feel like every time I go to a conference, I feel like there's like a dozen new programs. So it's dizzying to try to catch up with it. But like I said, I feel like even if you use some of the programs, it's gonna make such a huge difference.
That sounds like a net positive. I remember watching telenovelas like a decade ago, not decades, but when I started learning Spanish, it was you watch telenovelas. I am kind of like a subtitle caption person, and so I would switch my captions to Spanish even if it was like an anime in Japanese, because then I would have to be forced to like read the captions rather than just let it passively slip by. So it's kind of cool that AI is helping you save time, but also helping the student directly. Yeah.
Exactly. And like I said, I mean, there are so many benefits with AI use in the classroom, especially for world language. But like I said, I think the greatest thing that came with it is, like I said, there's the versatility. And like I said, it also gives the students, as I said before, the autonomy to do learning on their own terms with the modifications, accommodations that they need that I think in traditional teaching methods was not always readily available, even though you might have, your best intentions try to provide that. And like I said, I feel like I've been in education for quite some time now, and like there's still that difficulty of like, at least on my own, trying to provide all of the necessary modifications and accommodations that students need. So, like I said, it is very helpful in that aspect.
Yeah. So, what do you hope students take away from your class?
I would say, if for nothing else, I think a better appreciation or getting a better appreciation for the world around them. So, like I said, I think that applies to not only world language, or, but anthropology and sociology, obviously. Yeah, to gain a better appreciation for the world around them, to, I think, have the courage to explore beyond their own boundaries and comfort. And I see that a lot with the younger students as well, because, for obvious reasons, their view is a little bit more limited just because they just haven't had the experience yet. But I think once they start opening up and like, wow, like I hadn't thought about things this way before, I hadn't thought about that, before. On that too, not only seeing what's different, but seeing what's similar too. Um, I see that a lot with my world language class, and also anthropology, sociology as well. But I'm just going to use this world language example. So, especially with French, and I tell this to students all the time, even on the first day. I'm like, even if you've never taken a French lesson before, you've never seen anything in French, you've never heard anything in French, right? I promise you, you actually already know a lot of French, even though you don't realize it yet, because just for the fact that French and English have so many similarities. There's a lot of similar vocab, right, with cognates. A lot of the grammatical structures are pretty similar too. So I remind students that they're not working at ground zero. It's not like they have nothing to work with. Like, they already have a working base to, like I said, learn and acquire the language. It's just they need to learn how to most effectively utilize that. With anthropology and sociology, obviously, as I mentioned before, Ray, basically anything in the social world relates back to anthropology and sociology. So students will certainly they will deal with the world every single day. They will most likely see people every day. They will most likely interact with people every day, right? So it's just, it's, I think, a good practice, like I said, to learn a little bit more about our surroundings and our world, and to better understand why do things work the way that they work, So that's what I really hope. So, I mean, I think in terms of specific content, I think that depends on the particular student, right? Because obviously students will have different interests within that broader spectrum. But like I said, I think those are the core those are the core lessons I would like them to learn from me, or from anyone else in that particular situation too.
You made an excellent point about people not realizing how much of a language they already know. So for a while there, I was going really hard on Duolingo learning Arabic. And the number of words in Arabic that are also in Spanish that I kind of already knew was really surprising to me. So, as a mentor, what's the best piece of advice you've given, Walter?
Oh, man. Okay, that's a hard-hitting question. Let's see. Oh, as a mentor, I would say, I think probably the best would be, don't be afraid, be true to yourself. And you have your life to live. Don't let anyone else tell you how to live your life. And then, like I said, do what feels right to you. Because I think you need to live your genuine self. You need to live your genuine life. And you could ask for advice. You can ask for suggestions. You can, get others' perspectives on things. But at the end of the day, you need to be comfortable with the decisions that you make for yourself. So you need to know what's right for you. You need to know how you feel you will succeed in life. So you can't let others dictate what that's going to be, I think.
Well, thank you for joining us on our podcast. And thank you for studying with us today. We hope you can join us for our next podcast episode where we'll study another session with discussion on social sciences in reality.
Wonderful. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed our conversation, and yeah, a great way to spend Friday.
Thank you, Walter.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.